Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the early Middle Ages, okay? So we left off in class talking about some really, really important stuff. We were talking about none other than one of Mr. Terry's favorite things to talk about, the Vikings, right? We talked about the Vikings. We went over Charlemagne a little bit more, talked about some of his reforms, the Missa Dominica, the Carolingian Renaissance. We talked about Carolingian minuscule a little bit and how a bunch of y'all are using capital and lowercase letters right now because of the early Middle Ages and because of none other than Charlemagne himself. Now, the thing about it, though, that we also need to understand is we had a really nice in-depth discussion in class today about the Vikings, right? The Vikings, that warrior culture from Scandinavia that was very, very well known for its raids and its colonization that led to the establishment of feudalism, right? Now, we're going to get to that here in about 2 seconds, but that right there, this point, probably the most important point on this entire slide, okay? Now, the thing about it that we talked about in class, though, also, we talked about how, like, the Vikings are going to lead to the growth of larger kingdoms. We're going to talk about how literally the Vikings actually discovered North America about 400, 500 years before Columbus ever did. Yes, take that, nerd. So yeah, you thought you were so awesome, and then the Vikings and Leif Erikson were there way before you were, right? Now, the thing about it, though, when we're going into it also, we talked about how you can see the Vikings in the modern era, right? We talked about how you can see the Vikings in the modern era on TV shows like the one that I'm watching right now, known as The Last Kingdom. They're very, very well known historically for their longboat design and being that very warrior-like culture. We talked about how they had like a day where they would bathe themselves all the time, like Saturdays, and this is a Viking comb that was actually discovered outside of Norway. We talked about how the days of the week are all named after their gods, not all of them anyway, but several of them. And then we also talked about Harold Bluetooth, who, of course, is the origin of the Bluetooth symbol on your phone. Now, the thing about it, he didn't, like, invent it or anything, but you know what I'm saying. It was named after him. But also, the Vikings and their colonization is going to be the biggest thing that we got to pick right back up on that we kind of left off of in class. So you'll see all of this stuff throughout here, like all this green and all this red and, like, darker colors. So everything in darker red is an early settlement of the Vikings, right? These are about 8th century, 9th century right here, then going into the 10th and also, of course, into Greenland and Iceland. Now, what we need to understand, though, is that look at this green right here, right? All the green on this map denotes areas subject to frequent Viking raids, right? Now, really quickly, what's a raid, all right? A raid, of course, is going to be a moment or a movement when the Vikings actually showed up at people's houses or monasteries or places or castles or villages or whatever, and they were there to take several things, right? They were there for anything that they could consume, right? Foodstuffs like cattle, and then also like foodstuffs like wheat and grain and barley. They were also, though, there mostly for money, right? Like, so they wanted money and stuff of value so they could sell it and then use it to buy other stuff, right? So the thing about it, though, that we need to understand is they were very well known for raiding monasteries and taking relics, and then also they were very well known for killing large numbers of people that lived in these places. They would do it in very interesting and creative ways. They would draw and quarter people. There was this apparently famous example of this thing known as the blood eagle, where they would remove the person's lungs and drape them over to their shoulders as a symbol of like the Viking prowess over the people that they took over. But the thing about it is, y'all, we talked about this in class. This was the Lindisfarne raid that happened actually in 792, right? Or excuse me, 793. And that monastery raid is kind of considered the beginning of the Viking era. Now, when we're looking at this, these raids, these boats, this stuff, this culture, that of the Vikings, is going to scare the ever-loving bejesus out of people. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see the establishment of this thing known as feudalism, right? Now, go ahead and really quick, while we're getting into this, go ahead and write me a nice little title over this chart that we're about to draw and label it feudalism, or you can call it the feudal system, right? Now, the feudal system or feudalism is going to be a system of social class status it's going to be a system of 3 things, okay? You need to write these down nearby this somewhere around this chart that you're about to draw. But what it is feudalism is a system of social class status, okay, or social classes, 2, land ownership, and 3, the most important one being that of protection, right? So what is going on right now in Europe with all this craziness, with these Vikings raiding everything and stuff like that, is that kings, lords, and some of these other high-ranking officials throughout like early Middle Ages European society are deciding to organize their entire land plots in a way that they can defend themselves from Viking invasion and from like actually future attack by any barbarian group, whether it be the Vikings, the Saxons, the Angles. Well, actually, the Angles and the Saxons established the feudal system so they could actually avoid the Vikings as well in England, but that was during a period called the Danelaw. That's a little bit different. So going into it, though, that you need to understand is this is a very simple system, okay? This system basically denoted the idea that there was a landowner, and then there was military protection, and then there were workers on that land that were protected by the entire system. But let's go ahead and get into it real quick. When we're going through this chart, you need to understand that at the very, very top of the feudal system was typically the king or the ruler of the largest plots of lands. For example, in our early Middle Ages era, you're going to be talking about people like Clovis, Charlemagne, and then also talking about like Charlemagne's dad, Pippin the Short. You're going to be talking about like many other people that actually ruled over massive plots of, or not plots of land, but massive territories and kingdoms, okay? And this entire system went back to actually benefit the king themselves. Now, underneath them, at the tip of the triangle itself, is known as the lords or the nobles. Now, for some of y'all that have never been around European history a lot before, you don't really quite know what a lord or a noble is. What a lord or a noble is a high-ranking, prestigious family that's been given land and title by the king themselves, right? They've been knighted, and they are actually believed to be in the upper echelons of the entirety of European society at this point, and particularly within that of their kingdom. So you know lords and nobles pretty well. You've called them a bunch of different titles, right? You've called them earls and barons and dukes and things like that. They're ranking or high-ranking officials and high-ranking noble families within the European class structure. And they own all of the land. Now, if you go online and you look up feudal system diagram or something like that, you'll get, Google image will spit back a lot of triangles to you, right? Now, Mr. Terry has edited this feudal diagram to be, I think, much more accurate, okay, when you're actually looking at it, because with the feudal diagram, or with this feudal diagram in general, I want you to imagine for a second that each of these triangles is a plot of land known as a fief, okay? Each of those triangles is a plot of land, so the reason why I have the triangle separate from that of the rectangle right here that includes the king and the ruling powers at the top, the reason why I have it separate is because there's hundreds of these triangles, right? Hundreds of plots of land and hundreds of plots of, or like plots of like farmland and stuff like that all over these different kingdoms, and lords and nobles own each one, so that's why they're at the top of each triangle, right? Now, next up, though, underneath them, you have people that are employed by the lords and the nobles, known as vassals or knights, okay? Like, so they are actually going to be very important when it comes to actually repelling those barbarians and repelling those Vikings when they show up. Now, the last but not least, though, you have these people known as serfs, okay? Serfs made up about 75% of the population of Europe in the early Middle Ages, all right? Now, serfs are very important. Because they're a little bit different from peasant. All right, so now look, big thing that we need to understand about it, though, is a lot of times what people believe is that a serf is a slave, right? No, a serf is a worker, all right? Serf is a worker, and technically they're not a slave because they cannot be bought or sold, right? And they are bound to the land by a contract. Now, that's very important that you understand about the serfs themselves, right? The lord and the serf's family would actually come to an agreement based on how long that they expected to live there, right? And the thing about it is the lord would say, okay, well, you are indentured to this land for the next 5 years, you and your family and subsequent family members until you pay off your debt and or until you, like, your contract is up, will live here and provide my entire system with labor, all right? So now look, the thing about it, though, is you could actually argue that serfs are economic slaves and stuff like that, but we're not going to get into that with those weeds right now. But the thing about it, though, in general, is serfs are very important, that they're not actually slaves in the common day sense, but they are actually going to be very taken advantage of and disenfranchised working classes, okay? So in the essence, though, the serf would then provide labor back to the lord, right? They would work the land, and they would actually grow different crops and farmable goods and wheats and barley so that the lord could actually sell them. The vassals and the knights would provide military service, and so if the lord ever needed to actually go to war with another warring lord, or if they actually wanted to or if the vassals ever needed to actually protect the land itself from the invasion of Vikings or from the invasion of like any kind of other barbarian group, that's who was there to actually protect the entire system. And then last but not least, the lord pays taxes back to the king. The king bestows the honor and the land upon the lords, and the system keeps going round and round and round. Now, the thing about the feudal system, though, is this bad boy is going to cling to life and hang on to European society and culture for the next several hundred years, right? To give you some kind of essence or some kind of understanding of how long this is going to be, it's flirting with 1,000 years that it was actually around in Europe. The feudal system, though, is also going to be one of the biggest reasons why economies are going to get stifled for a little while during the Middle Ages and kind of not progress until we actually finally hit into the Renaissance, right? And it's important to remember that serfs, of course, are not slaves. They are bound to the land by a contract, right? Now, going into it, though, a little bit, we are now leaving off with the fact that the Vikings are going to cause that feudal system. And we're we're now moving into not the early Middle Ages anymore, but we're getting into the high Middle Ages, okay? We are progressing pretty quickly. Now, some of you might be asking yourself, well, Mr. Terry, how can we move through the early Middle Ages like so quickly? How did we get from 476 BC, or excuse me, 476 AD all the way up to about 1000 AD that fast, right? Or like how was that even possible? Well, the thing about it that you have to understand is that not a lot of the stuff about the early Middle Ages is very, very well documented. Only about 4% of people could read at the height of the Carolingian Renaissance, right? So we're looking at an era where we're going off the best of what we understand and know. All that stuff about the Vikings that we talked about, we know all of those things for a fact, but man, so many things about the nitty-gritty parts of their history were lost because most Scandinavians and most Vikings were actually illiterate. So getting into it, though, we're now getting into the high Middle Ages. The high Middle Ages is going to be a period of time, though, from about like 1000 to 1300 AD when things are going to start getting a little bit better, right? Like, so things are going to start to emerge in Europe, both economically, politically, and socially. Now, going into it, though, as well, just looking at this picture, you can tell that the high Middle Ages is going to be a period of more economic progress, right? Like, looking at this, you can actually see how the feudal system is going to evolve during the high Middle Ages and how it's going to lead to this newer system that some people are going to refer to as the manor system, right? But look, you have this large architecture in this castle right here, this military defense wall. You have literally like peasants out here farming. You have a knight or a vassal protecting the land with a bow and arrow right there. So as you can tell, things are beginning to actually kind of evolve a little bit and grow like throughout that of like the European Middle Ages. And on top of everything else, when we're looking at this picture, something else you need to understand is by the time we get to the high Middle Ages, we're going to start actually calling the feudal system by a multitude of different names, okay? So feudalism is the actual system of social class, land ownership, and protection that we use, or the word that we use to describe those three things, right, in that original system. Now, this is a picture of what it would look like, but as it began to grow, it evolved also into this thing known as the manor system, right? And we can use these words interchangeably. You can say manor system or feudal system as often as you want. It doesn't really matter. But the manor system basically also kind of brings in the idea of how the land was divided, all right? Like how the land was actually kind of chopped up between the lord, the workers, and the vassals as well. And the manor system usually refers to the fact that a manor or a large keep or castle was actually usually on an elevated hill, and then all the lands that surrounded that were then divided and subdivided between where the serfs would work, the serfs' actual like village, which would have been down the road a little bit, and then also a very important location that we'll talk about later on, the like community church. Right now, going into it though, also that we need to. Oh my God, why are you this way? But yeah, going even further into it as well, as we begin to expand off the manor system, there's going to be a massively important theme that's going to be coming down during the high Middle Ages, right? So when we're talking about the high Middle Ages, we need to really, really be able to assess the power and the growing power of that of the Middle Age Catholic Church, right? So it's something that we actually talked about a little bit, like when we were talking about the fall of Rome, when we were talking about Constantine legalizing Christianity with the Edict of Milan. The thing about it that we need to understand as well, though, is in Western Europe in particular, that the Catholic Church is going to be growing into a very large, dominant political power, okay? So the Catholic Church is going to survive the fall of Rome, and their political power is going to grow very, very quickly, okay? Now, politically speaking, we'll get into this a little bit later on, but the Catholic Church is going to become a dominant, like, staple, a dominant thing throughout all of Middle Ages society. And it's also going to grow very, very strong and very, very wealthy to boot as well as we're going through this entire like time period, okay? Now, the Catholic Church, really, really fast, we have to actually go into it. We have to talk about now the power and importance of the Catholic Church during the high Middle Ages, okay? So the next whole section of your notes is going to be referring to that of the power and the importance of the Catholic Church during the high Middle Ages. Now, what we're talking about, yes, this is a title. You're welcome. So, now, going into it, though, what are some things that we already know? So some of the stuff that we're about to talk about on this first slide is mostly due to mostly for people that might not actually be, or might actually be in the class but not be Catholic, or might have missed a couple of things in theology class and stuff like that. But let's go ahead and dive headfirst into the things we already know. Who's the person that leads the Catholic Church? Well, of course, none other than the Pope. During the high Middle Ages, you are going to have the same exact system. A papal representative is going to be elected and is going to rule for the term of their life or until they retire, okay? And so, of course, the Pope is going to be the leader of the church, and it's been that way ever since the Great Schism, right? Now, we talked about the Great Schism, remember, all the way back in the Byzantine era, when it's going to separate into Eastern Orthodox and the medieval Catholic Church, right? Now, are there other leaders as well? Is there a hierarchy itself or a bureaucratic system that exists underneath the Pope? And the answer to that is big fat yes, right? There are other people that are actually involved with the Catholic Church as well. You have cardinals, bishops, parish priests, and several other people within that community as well. Now, the next question that you got to ask yourself as well is what kind of figures or icons and their stories would be of heavy use in Catholic faith. So what you're going to notice during the High Middle Ages as we go into the Renaissance and things like that, saints and their stories are going to be a massive importance when it comes to the growth of the Catholic Church. And the reason why it's important to kind of bring them up right now is because when we get to the Protestant Reformation, you're going to actually see the Protestants, as they begin to grow, saints lose their importance, and also many Protestant faiths don't even really refer to saints very, very often. So, many Protestant faiths don't refer to saints very, very often, right? Now, how often do you think people, though, went to church during the High Middle Ages or during the Middle Ages in general? Well, the answer to this one is actually very, very different from that of, the regular everyday person. How often do they go? 2 to 3 times a day, all right? So, every day, 2 to 3 times a day. Sometimes they went to morning mass. Usually they received the Eucharist every single day. And oftentimes they would go for reconciliation or confession throughout the day as well. And what language do you think the Bible was only written in during the Middle Ages? Well, this is a really, really important one. It's only written in Latin, all right? So, now it was only written in Latin, and the people that could actually, read and decipher this text at the time, pretty much the only people were that of the priests, right? So the thing that we need to also understand as well is that masses during the Middle Ages were delivered in Latin. So literally, this priest would actually speak the entire mass in Latin, and no one in the crowd could understand him, right? And also, on top of everything else, that the priest used to actually do it like this. If you're looking down in the corner at me right now, you can see my back. They would literally face the altar and not even face the people during mass, and they would deliver the entire thing in Latin, right? So the Middle Ages mass, as you can tell, is a little bit different than that of the common day Catholic Church, but it's mostly due to the fact that the Catholic Church has gone through a series of different reforms, right? A series of different reforms, and also the Catholic Church does look back on its time during the Middle Ages and does kind of tend to apologize for a little bit because some things are going to get a little bit dicey, right? So let's start small, though, okay? So when we're looking at the growth of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, let's start as the smallest person. How would it affect you as an everyday person? How would it affect you if you lived in this village and if you actually lived nearby that little village church? Hold on, let me get back to where I was. All right, so yeah, that little village church right there. Well, first and foremost, you got to understand that every single small village church that sat on every single manor was ran by what's known as a parish priest, right? A local priest that would actually deliver mass and actually be in charge of several different things within the village life itself, but we'll get to that here in about 2 seconds. Now, there's some simple importance to the reason why the church was so important. Middle Ages churches are actually going to provide a lot of services, right? Including access to sacraments like marriage and baptism and burial and confession and things like that. They're also going to help regulate holidays, right? Or holy days. That's where the word holidays actually comes from, okay? There were several different holy days that serfs were actually not allowed to work on. A lot of people talk about this as well, and this kind of flared up on the internet for a little bit, is that actually medieval serfs only worked for about 150 days a year. The rest of them were actually full of different holidays and days where they actually didn't work, like for the lords and stuff like that, to try and keep them as happy as possible. Now, this is a little bit of a loaded explanation, a little bit of a loaded thing, because when you really look at the Middle Ages, every day was hard work because you had to chop wood for fire, and you also had to cook, and you also had to tend your own animals and stuff like that. So saying that they got days off is a little bit of a stretch. But the thing about it, though, is there were frequent holidays and holy days that actually took place within the village, regulated by the church, right? And then also, it's where you went to receive the Eucharist, right? When you went to receive the Eucharist as well, it's very, very important that we understand that during the Middle Ages is going to begin the growth as well of the idea of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is the concept in the Middle Ages, also in the modern day Catholic Church that has endured since the Middle Ages, where literally by taking in the bread of Christ, or the bread that represents the Eucharist, it turns directly into the body of Christ, the physical representation of Christ as well. But what we're going to do right here is we're going to cut it off right there, and we're actually going to talk about a lot more of this stuff in class. But I'll see y'all soon, and we'll talk about the political importance of paying your tithe and dealing out justice in the village church. We're going to look at some pretty buildings and stuff like that as well. But I'll see y'all soon.